Institute provides high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. We've now transitioned to virtual programming with the help of generous donations from you, our fans. This fall and winter, we're presenting many other opportunities for learning. Just check out our website, habermaninstitute.org. Next week, we'll have a wonderful opportunity to learn Torah with a world-class scholar, Dr. Aviva Zornberg of Jerusalem. If you've never studied with her, or even if you have, you're in for a unique treat. This coming Monday morning at 11 o'clock, that's an unusual time for us, but Monday morning at 11 o'clock, she'll discuss the last weeks of the life of Moses, entitled, Let Me See That Good Land, the Story of a Human Life. You can register for this program on our website. On to this evening's program. Dr. Stephen Zipperstein is the Daniel E. Kashlin Professor in Jewish Culture and History at Stanford University and the author and editor of 9 books. His most recent book, also the title of tonight's program, is Pogrom, Kishinev and the Tilt of History. Since its publication in 2018, it has received wide acclaim and a number of national prizes. Professor Zipperstein currently serves as chair of the Stanford History Department's Graduate Studies Committee. And for 16 years, he was director of the Taub Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford. He's also taught at universities in Russia, Poland, France, and Israel. And for 6 years, he taught at Oxford University. His articles have appeared in the New York Times Sunday Book Review, the Washington Post, the New Republic, to name just a few. During the program, we'll all have questions and comments. While our presenter is speaking, the chat function will be set so that you can share these with our moderators, Matt and Becky. Later on in the program, they'll open up the chat for discussion with Professor Zipperstein. Please remember to keep your microphone muted. If you would be so kind as to share your video portrait, you will help us see each other and hopefully feel that we're all members of this learning community. We're thrilled to have you with us, Professor Zipperstein. The screen is all yours.
Thank you very much. And I want to dedicate this talk to Rabbi Gordon Fuller. I don't know if you're there, but Rabbi Fuller rather pursued me ever since the appearance of this book a bit over 2 years ago. And in every instance, I wasn't able to come to the Washington, D.C. area, and he was asking if I could possibly appear before you before he retired, but his retirement came faster than my ability to come and join you. It's a rare thing for a rabbi to be known as Gordy, and if you're there, I want to thank you for your continued interest. And I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion. Let me start with this. I really never intended to write this book. I had signed a contract with another trade publisher to write a history of Russian and East European Jewry from the end of the 18th century to the present. And then, in order to really protect myself from constant insomnia, I subdivided the book into various slices, giving myself 3-4 weeks at a time to research each of the slices. And the Kishnev pogrom was just one. And I decided in the end to write this book when I discovered something that I just really speak about in the book for only a paragraph or two, but persuaded me that there was a real story to tell, and that through the prism of the Kishnev pogrom, one could learn a great deal about what it is about the Jewish past that has been remembered, what has been forgotten, how it is that Jews have come to conceive of their collective past over the last century and more, and how others have come to see Jews. The incident that persuaded me to write this book was the following. In the summer of 1903, there occurred the second second party Congress of the Social Democratic Party, the Russian Marxist Party. It was an immensely long meeting. It started in Brussels. It ended up in London. Incredibly long speeches, and it actually was called the Second Party Congress, but in fact it was the First Party Congress. The first meeting in Minsk a few years before was a meeting of a few left-wing Jews. Calling it the Second Party Congress sounded rather more important. But it was at this meeting that Lenin was able to consolidate his definition of what constituted the party, as a small elite group that would be, in a sense, run in a rather concerted way by someone like Lenin. He defined, basically, Bolshevism was consolidated at this meeting, and it was consolidated largely because Lenin knew that he would win a vote over the consolidation of the party only if he managed to get the Jewish Socialist Labor Bund to leave. The Jewish Socialist Labor Bund, a then rather powerful and potent force in Russian Jewry with over 30,000 members, which was quite a remarkable feat for an illegal organization. And he knew the Bund, or he sensed the Bund would leave a meeting where Lenin sought to define the party's workings in a concerted way, where the Bund would lose all autonomy, because he knew the Bund was preoccupied more so than ever before with defending Jews and defending the lives of Jews in the wake of the Kishnev pogrom. And he also knew that the Jewish Socialist Labor Bund in an internationalist setting couldn't actually speak specifically about defending Jewish lives, because that would seem like a trans-class argument, and it would seem exceedingly nationalistic. In other words, Lenin knew that the Bund was fighting with both of its hands tied behind his back. And when I realized that the formative meeting of Russian Marxism was shaped inordinately by preoccupation with the Kishinev pogrom, it occurred to me that there was a story to tell. And I'll now tell you the story as it came to unfold for me. What intrigued me from the outset was that this event, which occurs in April 1903, in which some 47 Jews are killed, 2 others die of wounds incurred during the pogrom afterwards. It's this event that ends up becoming the event that produces the greatest amount of documentation of any other single event in the Russian Jewish past, and massive amount of documentation for reasons that I'll explain over the course of the next few minutes. And at the same time, barely anything that actually occurred at the event is remembered. Almost everything that ends up occurring at the event is the product of mythology, the product of forgeries, the product of stories that actually end up being more persuasive than history itself. And what I came to appreciate, in other words, as writing this book, is that history, once you actually ask an historian to tell you definitively what happened, an historian begins, if you will, to stutter, because there's so much contingency in history. There's, if I were asked by any of you, was there an inordinate enmity against Jews in Kishnev greater than in other places, I wouldn't be able to answer that question in a straightforward way. Of course, there was enmity. There was a vicious pogrom that I'll describe. At the same time, large numbers of non-Jews had Jews, unannounced, obviously, during the riot, rush into their homes and protected Jews during the riot. History is made of pitfalls, of contingencies. Myth is immeasurably more coherent. Myth you could capture in a simple sentence. Myth you could capture in a tweet. History, if you will, sounds like Jeb Bush. myth sounds like the other guy. And what I also came to learn while I was working on this episode is that attitudes toward Jews, even in a place like late imperial Russia, were by and large dislike or suspicion of Jews was thick and widespread. Attitudes toward Jews are in many ways a double-edged sword, with many of the qualities attributed to Jews um, understood as both unpleasant and also pleasant. Jews were widely assumed to be inordinately good at making money, a quality that many saw as noisome, others saw as impressive. Jews were seen as inordinately capable of avoiding the allure of liquor, something that was seen as suspicious by many Russians, something that was seen as admirable by many Russians. In order to actually consolidate negative attitudes, you need someone from above, political figures, ideological figures who end up coalescing otherwise inchoate attitudes, shaping them. And that's precisely what ends up happening in the Kishinev pogrom, as I'll try to outline. So some of the reasons why the Kishinev pogrom ends up defining the Russian Jewish past more so than any other event, and in many respects more than any other attack against Jews. 2 years later, on the streets of Odessa in October 1905, 600 or 700 Jews will be slaughtered. Odessa does not come to be known primarily as a place of slaughtering of Jews. Kishnev does. So part of the reason has to do with chronology. This is the first massacre of Jews at the beginning of the 20th century in the Russian Empire. A century that is ushered in with the belief that this will be a century of harmony and peace. We could view that with a degree of irony, but still that's how it came to be seen widely, certainly in the Western world. Secondly, it's a product of ideology. Never before or afterwards would the Jewish political ideologies that very much dominate the cultural scene in Russia be quite as influential. Herzl, it occurs in 1903. Herzl, the head of the Zionist movement, dies in 1904. The Jewish Socialist Labor Bund has some 35,000 followers in 1903. It will dwindle down to a few thousand for a whole variety of reasons by 1906, 1907. In many ways, the memory of the Kishinev pogrom and its ostensible lessons is consolidated by institutions, by political institutions that etch the lessons of the pogrom into the Jewish consciousness. There's also a degree of contingency. Kishinev is located, Kishinev functions as a kind of urban depot comparable to that of Fresno in California. It's basically a depot largely built around the processing of agricultural goods. It's located at the far, far west, a corner of a southwestern corner of Russia. It hugs newly created Romania, and it's just and at its western border, it hugs the eastern reaches, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it happens to be the easiest place in Russia to smuggle out goods, which is saying something because it's pretty easy to bribe officials in Russia to smuggle out goods. And so hello? I heard a voice. I thought that someone was objecting to my comments about smugglers. And so it's, and consequently, the Zionist movement several years before 1903 establishes its correspondence bureau in Kishinev. In any event, it's the easiest place to smuggle out news, and consequently news about the Kishinev pogrom is smuggled out with alacrity. Had the same event occurred 200 miles to the east, it probably would have been a local event. remembered by local Jews, but it would not have had the worldwide significance. So there's ideology, there's contingency, and there's also, if you will, the impact of photography. Now, photography is invented years before 1903, but it's very expensive and very few newspapers use it. This is the first catastrophe, the first event in Jewish life that is actually captured with photography in newspapers. And to some extent, it seems to me, the relatively small number of Jews killed in Kishnev contributes to Kishnev's notoriety in no small measure because you could actually capture, as was captured worldwide, pictures of 47 shrouded dead Jews in one picture. You can't capture 600 Jews lying on the streets of Odessa. It's impossible. Typologically, in other words, there's something similar to the impact that Anne Frank has in the wake of the Holocaust. You could imagine one prepubescent Jewish girl having been killed, murdered, her life snuffed out. It's almost impossible to imagine the death of 6 million. And so ideology, proximity, contingency, photography, and then this event ends up capturing almost immediately the attention of the now, by then, rather large, 500,000, politically preoccupied Jewish community on the Lower East Side of New York. And it's the first major event of its time that occurs that has no political coloring. It's trans-political. You could actually unite Jews. It's really the Kishinev pogrom that allows East European Jewry to push aside the still regnant Central European German Jewish leadership and to establish over the course of the next few years hegemony in American Jewish life. They do it through an energized Yiddish foreword, which before the Kishinev pogrom is a kind of boring sheet, mostly put out by the American Socialist Party, and is energized by the Kishinev pogrom. They do it eventually with the creation of the American Jewish Congress that begins to compete with the German-dominated American Jewish Committee. It's an event that allows East European Jews to enter into this as the centerpiece of Jewish communal leadership in America. And finally, and tell me if this resembles anyone who you might have heard of recently, there's the enormous attention that's given to this event by the newspapers owned by Hearst. So Hearst is someone who's rich because he's inherited his father's wealth. He's enormously ambitious. He doesn't only want to have a media empire. He's already in Congress. He's hoping to run on the Democratic Party ticket for president, or at least become the governor of New York. And he recognizes the political and electoral power of East European Jews living in New York, and he's hoping to capitalize on it. And he transforms several of his newspapers that up until then were basically akin to scandal sheets like the National Enquirer into newspapers with the first focus of international news focusing on the Kishinev pogrom. Up until the Kishinev pogrom, the word pogrom is, and really through 1903, the very word pogrom is either defined by newspapers or put in italics. By the end of 1903, the term pogrom is as well known a Russian term as Tsar or vodka. That's an indication of the imprint that the Kishinev pogrom leaves on the world. Now, what actually comes to be understood about the Kishinev pogrom, and what do I mean about the chasm between what occurred actually and what is remembered? And what are the various, what do I mean by the various forgeries that fall and tumble from the rubble of the Kishinev pogrom? The most influential of all of these forgeries, or the documents that are shaped by the Kishinev pogrom, and that surfaces a few weeks after the pogrom itself, is the so-called Pleva letter. Pleva is the Minister of Interior of Russia. He's barely known before the Kishinev pogrom. A letter surfaces a few weeks after the pogrom that's published by the Times of London, um, that signed by Pleve, that indicates that pogromists should be given a green light to attack Jews for a couple of days. Um, the um, the correspondence of the correspondent from the Times of London is thrown out of the country. It takes a couple of weeks for the Russian government to insist that that Pleve never wrote the letter. It's widely believed that Pleve did write the letter, and it's the Pleve letter that is the foundation for the relatively unrestricted Jewish immigration to the United States from this period up through the First World War and up until the 1920s. This occurs at a moment when Chinese immigration is restricted as of 1902. There's talk about restricting Jewish immigration to England, the Anti-Alien Act, which is debated at the very same time. But the relatively unrestricted immigration that allows for some 2.5 million Jews to come to the United States, largely from Russia, also from Romania and the eastern reaches, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Galicia, is largely a byproduct of the Pleve letter and the belief in America that the Russian government itself is responsible for the killing, the beating, and the rape of Jews on the streets of Odessa, on the streets of Kishnev. And as it turns out, we know almost certainly Pleve did not write the letter. The letter was written, we don't know precisely who wrote the letter. It was likely written by a Jewish radical or a friendly non-Jewish radical who believed, no doubt sincerely, that if Pleve was tied to a chair, like in a scene of Homeland, this is what he would say. And it was written, no doubt, with sincerity, with the belief that they were telling the truth, that the real truth was behind a curtain and couldn't be told. But the Russian government, the greatest fear of the Russian government, as we've come to know, as we've studied Russian documents over the course, ever since the fall of the Romanov regime in 1917, the greatest fear of the Russian government were riots, either rural riots or urban riots. And for good reason, because the Romanov regime in the end is brought down in February 1917 by an urban riot. The belief, one of the regnant, firm beliefs in Jewish life, and one that I have no likelihood of dissuading you from tonight, the belief that the Russian government is responsible for pogroms is inaccurate. During 1905, 1906, there are some local officials who, in the midst of a constitutional crisis, no doubt collaborate with those who are attacking Jews. But the central Russian government, as inimical, as negative as its attitude are toward Jews, is more fearful of rioting on its streets or in its countryside than it is fearful of Jews. In many ways, it's inordinately, it's the Kishnev pogrom, and the proof offered by the Pleve letter that consolidates not only the belief that the Russian government is responsible for the pogroms, but also in many ways the fundamental suspicion that Jews end up feeling toward political conservatism, with Russia as the arch conservative country in the world and held responsible for actually fomenting more murders on its own streets. There's a good deal else that consolidates the Jewish romance with the left, a romance that I feel comfortable with, but the Pleve letter serves as an enormously influential factor. At the same time, from an entirely different sector, in an entirely different way, and influencing entirely different people, there's another document that's written and published in the immediate wake of the Kishinev pogrom that has an impact almost comparable to that of the Pleva letter. And that is the first version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Kishnev and the area around Kishnev is one of the epicenters of the far Russian right. And for a whole variety of reasons, some of the most ferociously far-right figures in Russia and most ferociously anti-Semitic figures in Russia live in that area. And there's a fundamental difference between the attitudes of such figures and Pleva, in that Pleva and most other Russian officials dislike Jews, but they don't know what is to be done with Jews. The far right is beginning to formulate ideas as to what must be done with regard to the insidious impact, as they understand it, of Jews in Russia, a source, as they see it, of Russian radicalism, a source of economic exploitation, a huge community that is, as they see it, an eternal enemy. And we have considerable evidence that there's a clutch of far-right figures who are at work on a document that ends up being rushed into press in a newspaper owned by Kishnev's leading anti-Semitic intellectual. And actually, at the time, Kishnev's leading anti-Semitic intellectual is Kishnev's leading intellectual, a man named Pavel Krushevan, who ends up publishing in a newspaper of his in St. Petersburg a couple of months after the pogrom, the first version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, I was able to learn a good deal about Krushevan while writing this book, and somewhat accidentally. Archival research, and in this case, these were papers in private hands, not in an archive, but this kind of research, these research stories are basically the only adventure stories that a historian like myself tells. Otherwise, we really sit in a room like this, surrounded by books like these, and we sit by ourselves and write and rewrite. And rewrites. Going out to archives means that we put on a hat, we put on a coat, we actually go out and we do things. My discovery of these Krushevan papers was something of a surprise. I'd learned from a German colleague also at work on the protocols that there was a man in Brookline, just down the street from Fenway, who had something relevant to the origin of the protocols. And when I went to see him, and I describe this at some length in my book, when I went to see him, we chatted for a while. He had been a journalist in Kishinev, what Kishnev has been renamed after the Soviets, and actually under an independent Moldova, and had been working as a journalist, and at one point he wrote an article about a sanitarium at the edge of the city, and in the institution was the nephew of Krushevan. Krushevan had died young at 49 of cancer, had left no heirs, and the nephew had papers of Krushevan. It turns out Krushevan's most sensitive papers that it seems he didn't want to anyone to see. And after sitting with this man, Misha Chazin, in his living room, he took down from a shelf a large white folder, placed it on my lap, and asked me if I wanted to take the material. And what I said to him is, we just met. And it turns out, as I started reading this material, that the first document I opened up was a journal, a diary that Krushevan had written at the age of 16, 15 or 16, maybe 16 or 17. And the diary, now this man Krushevan today is actually a celebrity in post-Soviet Russia. He's viewed as one of the great heroes of what's called Christian socialism, which means anti-capitalism, anti-Semitism, anti-feminism, and homophobia. And as I opened up his diary, It starts with a um, uh, um, with a declaration of love for a Cossack of the male persuasion with whom he's having sex. He declares he wishes he was born a lady, and in it is he was considered at his height the best placed Russian anti-Semite in the late imperial regime, and there were several fairly well-placed anti-Semites in the late imperial regime. And in it are a series of bankruptcy papers. His furniture has been assessed for value by bailiffs. He's absolutely broke. So much of what one assumed about Khrushchev simply was disproven by looking at the material that was sitting there on my lap, that I was able to bring back with me to Stanford, and that I was able to build into my book. For someone like Khrushchev, the sudden worldwide impact of the Kishinev pogrom proves what he and others had suspected all along, that Jews controlled the communication channels of the world, that Jews had an inordinate amount of hidden power. And consequently, he and others rushed the protocols into publication. He almost certainly was one of its authors. There are all kinds of linguistic fingerprints that I discuss in my book that seem to indicate or demonstrate that this first version of the protocols was written in the Kishnev region. And then for Jews, by far the most influential of all texts that inform Jews of what occurred in the Kishinev pogrom was the great poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik, Bir HaRegah, in the City of Killing. Bialik's, at the time of the Kishinev pogrom, or just afterwards, is 30. He's very well respected in the small hothouse of Hebrew literature, but not well known beyond it. He's a poet, doesn't have much money. He agrees to go to Kishnev after the pogrom. He's given a stipend to interview survivors and bystanders. He interviews them for 5 weeks, produces 5 large notebooks with testimonies, and then, for reasons never explained, the material that he collects is locked away for 60 years, surfaces only a few years ago. And instead of giving it to the historian Dubnov to produce a historical document about the Kishinev pogrom, he goes to his father-in-law's house outside of Zhytomyr and writes this poem. And a poem about an event in which some nearly 50 Jews are killed, about 1,500, about 600 Jews are injured, at least 40 women are raped, probably many more. Some 1,000 Jewish-owned buildings and homes are attacked, in some cases made into rubble. What this poem ends up focusing on, what's at the incendiary epicenter of this poem, is an attack on the cowardice of Jewish men. Jewish men who Bialik insists simply hide while their wives, their mothers, their sisters are being raped. That ends up being the most powerful and the most memorable part of the poem. The poem ends up entering into the Jewish-Palestinian school curriculum, having an inordinate influence, ends up being the primary document that shapes eventually Israeli attitudes toward exile. It ends up being debated massively by those who are discussing the school curriculum as to whether it poisons Israeli attitudes toward the diaspora. And I talk about some of those debates in a section of my book as well. Now, among the aspects, and the poem ends up having an enormous impact beyond the Hebrew-speaking world as well. Vladimir Jabotinsky, who isn't yet the Vladimir Jabotinsky of revisionist Zionism, but is an extraordinary linguist whose Hebrew is shaky, manages to master Hebrew with alacrity. He translates the poem into Russian. During the revolution of 1905, 1906, it becomes one of these sort of banner pieces recited by Jews across the political spectrum. It enters into Russian culture and radical culture as well. Now, among the features that's curious about this poem, about what Bialik recorded regarding the Kishnev pogrom, is that in his notes, he actually records in copious detail a record of Jewish self-defense. On the second day, the pogrom really lasts for about a day and a half, with the killings almost entirely on the second day over the span of about a 4-hour period, largely concentrated on 5 to 6 intersecting alleyways in the poorest part of Kishnev, where the poorest Jews live. Bialik records some 200, 250 Jews gathering on the morning of the second day, some with guns, and who attack Pogromous. He records all sorts of other sporadic events of self-defense. And moreover, Bialik is aware that the primary argument made by the defense attorneys in the trials of Pogromous, and there are trials of Pogromous that start in the summer of 1903 and continue into December of that year. The primary argument made by the defense attorneys is that the whole event was completely misconstrued and exaggerated by Jews. That in fact, the first day was just a day of kind of celebration with some non-Jews just jostling with Jews. But then Jews on the morning of the second day demonstrated such ferocity and such aggression that they attacked Gentiles, and Gentiles in self-defense had to be able to protect themselves. And that's what Jews call a pogrom. In other words, the main argument made by the defense attorneys of those put to trial is that Jews were inordinately aggressive as opposed to passive. It's been long assumed that Bialik, whose sense of the depravity of exile was deepened by what he saw in Kishnev, transformed the event into what he transformed. He wasn't writing history, he was writing poetry. He can't be expected to actually be judged as an historian, and the fact that the document ended up being read as history, this in itself is incorrect. What I did discover while working on this book is the following. One of the figures who I followed while working on the pogrom was once famous, now rather obscure, a man named Michael Davitt. Now, Michael Davitt was at the time a leading Irish revolutionary who made his living as a journalist. You can't make a living as a revolutionary. And he's hired by Hearst to go to Kishnev after the pogrom and write a series of dispatches about the pogrom. They're widely read. He ends up turning these dispatches into what is the first best-selling book in any Western language about the Jews of Russia. And I was able to track the notes that he took while working on the book back to the archive at Trinity College, Dublin. And he was known as a assiduous note taker. And just parenthetically, when I contacted the archivist at Dublin, hoping to read Davitt's notes, I was told that yes, Davitt's notes were in the archive, but I couldn't see them. And why couldn't I see them? Because the paper they were written on was too delicate to actually be handled. And because I'd worked previously in Russian archives, I figured that if I did the following, it might work. You go to an archive, and you go from a place as remote as California, and there's always going to be something that you can read. and you demonstrate to the archive over the course of 2 days, 3 days, Dublin's not the worst place in the world to go to, that, that you know how to handle material. And then the archivist takes pity. And so after 2 or 3 days of kind of waiting, a good-hearted archivist took pity, and I was able to see David's notes. And among the very surprising aspects of David's notes, and David came from a cultural milieu completely different from Bialik, and the two of them never spoke and had literally no common language. In David's notes, he writes the exact same thing that Bialik writes in his poem, that he's encounters as many as 100 Jewish men who admit to him that they hid away while their wives or sisters, their mothers were being raped. What does one do with this kind of evidence? What I would suggest is that, if you will, in Hebrew, gamze v'gamze, both occurred. To be sure, there was Jewish self-defense. And in a city where there were very few factories, consequently no Jewish Socialist Labor Bund, very little political organization, in a pogrom that suddenly occurs, and yet a surprisingly large number of Jews do engage in self-defense. And then there was what Bialik recorded. David never recorded in his articles or in his book what he wrote down in his notes. Bialik, it seems to me, felt that he could tell about this one aspect of the pogrom in a poem that would not be read as journalism, but would be read side by side with a copious reportage that had surfaced at the time with regard to the Kishnev pogrom. What I concluded was that there are all sorts of uncomfortable, embarrassing stories that occur and that are quashed by people who, like Jews in Russia, by Blacks in America, who are beleaguered, and you tend to quash these stories, just as David chose to do, or you choose to, in a sense, sequester the story in a poem that won't necessarily be read as history. We could talk about whether my interpretation of this was right or wrong during the discussion period. Just one final aspect of the pogrom's impact, and an aspect that was a complete surprise to me, and that is the connection between the Kishnev pogrom and the creation of the NAACP. And how could one draw any sort of connection? The pogrom has an enormous impact on American public life, Jewish and non-Jewish. There are some 250 public meetings, devoted protest meetings, that occur in the United States alone in the wake of the pogrom. There are plays that are instant plays that are produced in order to raise money for pogrom victims. There ends up being a play produced built around Michael Davitt that I discovered in an archive at New York Public Library. The pogrom enters into synagogue ritual with Yiddish and Hebrew poems about the pogrom, produced before Bialik's, introduced into the Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah ritual of Jews in New York already by fall 1903. Theodore Roosevelt, the American president, denounces the pogrom. Hearst in Congress insists that America should declare war on Russia because of the pogrom. In the wake of all this hubbub, a large number of fairly small Black newspapers end up writing about how indeed the Kishnev pogrom was a terrible event, but how is it that this event ends up being denounced broadly in America, across the American spectrum, including by the president, when lynching is not condemned. And as it happened at the time, even the Socialist Party didn't condemn lynching out of fear of alienating white workers and seeming to favor ununionized or non-member black victims. Lynching at the time was typically blamed in some ways across the political spectrum on Black behavior, on sexual appetite, on crime, Black crime, on Blacks in the pocket of political racketeers and the like. Much as typologically in Russia, many in Russia blamed pogroms on Jews. On Jews engaging in economic exploitation, excessive radicalism, and the like. And so you begin to see percolating in the mostly independent Black press questions about the connection between pogroms in Russia and lynching in the United States. And if the one is condemned emphatically, why isn't the other condemned? And such ideas begin circulating, especially in the left. But the connection is drawn emphatically only a few years later by a now unknown but once quite prominent couple, William English Walling and his wife, Anna Strunsky. Anna Strunsky, I'm proud to say, a graduate of Stanford University, who travel in Russia during the 1905-1906 revolution. Walling writes what comes to be the first major book about Russian radicalism. It's acknowledged by John Reed several years later in his great classic published just after the Russian Revolution, 10 Days That Shook the World. And they come back to the States. And soon after they come back to the States in 1908 or 9, I haven't reread that chapter in a while, 1908, there's the Springfield riot, the first riot, anti-Black riot in a northern town. The English, Walling covers it for a liberal U.S. newspaper. And they begin to, and soon afterwards, they begin to tour, and they begin to tour on a book tour, talking about Walling's book about Russian radicalism, Russia's Message. And on the stage of Cooper Union in 1908, while talking about the insidious nature of pogroms in Russia, quite instinctively, Anna Strunsky stands up and says, as bad as pogroms are, lynchings are perhaps even worse. And that night, meetings begin, eventually a meeting in their apartment in the West 30s in New York that results in the creation of the NAACP, an organization actually created by virtue of the preoccupation with the intersection between pogroms, originally the Kishnev pogrom, and lynching in America. Let me end just by reading the last few paragraphs of my book, and then we'll talk. Okay. Now I wish I could hear your voices. Pogrom, Kishnev, and the Tilt of History explores how history is made and remade, what is retained and elided, and why. I examine how one particular moment managed to so chisel itself onto contemporary Jewish history and beyond it, that it held meaning even for those who never heard of the town, know nothing of its details, and nonetheless draw lessons from it. It was a moment that cast a shadow so deep, wide, and variegated as to leave its imprint on Jews, on Jew haters, and on wounds licked ever since. Studying Kishnev provides the opportunity to cut across standard barriers, separating Russian and Jewish, European, Palestinian Jewish, and American Jewish history, and to wade through the pogrom's residue in many different, oddly mismatched corners. Its gruesome stories would frequently outdistance the sufficiently gruesome events themselves. It took weeks for the press to disprove, for example, the widely reported rumor that the bellies of pregnant women had been cut open and stuffed with chicken feathers. From the start of my research for this work, it intrigued me that Kishnev's violence, the worst of it lasting some 3 to 4 hours in a cluster of intersecting streets, would come to epitomize this community to a far greater extent than any other moment in Russian Jewish life. These alleyways, especially Asia Street, immortalized now in countless newspapers, would become the best known of all Russian Jewish locales. Its humble dwellings soon the most telling of metaphors for the impoverishment and grim tenuousness of Jewish life under the Tsars. The impact of these impressions, reinforced over the course of the past century, on Jewish perceptions of the world, the designs of Gentiles, the exercise of Jewish power, and the immorality of what Benjamin Netanyahu has derisively called turning the other cheek, are among the questions that have kept me fixed on this moment and its resilience. This then is a microcosm as well as an international history of an event that was surely vile, but less murderous and less catastrophic than so many others occurring soon afterward, and yet would overshadow nearly all. Quote, the time and place are the only things I'm certain of. Beyond that is the haze of history and pain. This is how Alexander Hemon begins his novel, The Lazarus Project, built around a bizarre, widely reported 1908 incident in which 19-year-old Lazarus Averbach was shot to death in the home of Chicago's police chief. Why Averbach came to the house, he had never before met the policeman, and whether or not he actually threatened the chief's life, as was reported, remains unclear. But Averbach's behavior was irrevocably linked at the time to his having been a witness to the Kishnev pogrom. Hemon writes, quote, Lazarus came to Chicago as a refugee, a pogrom survivor. He must have seen horrible things. He may have snapped. He was 14 in 1903 at the time of the pogrom. Did he remember it in Chicago? Was he a survivor who resurrected it in America? Did he have nightmares about it? End quote. My book, too, explores history's nightmares. And much like the Averbach tale, it's a story of the uneasy interplay of truth and fiction. A fiction so unreservedly believed that it would become more potent than most truths. I revisit it in an effort to sort through it so as to better understand the tragedy itself and what was made of it over the course of more than a century. Whether cited explicitly or not, the Kishnev pogrom continues to provide a well-thumbed, coherent roadmap, one that retains the imprimatur of history. Such accounts are bolstered by the use of evidence, recalled endlessly, but such evidence is at best imperfect, and at its worst, not evidence at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zipperstein. That was a great lecture, a fascinating lecture, and I'm sure that everyone out there has more questions to ask. So far, I've received a couple of questions in the chat. So if anybody else wants to send me, you can send me questions in the chat, which I'll begin with. So,
and I told Matt earlier, don't hesitate asking uncomfortable questions. Maybe not. Let me hesitate asking profoundly uncomfortable questions, but share with me any surprise that you might have felt in listening to what I said, because I know it runs contrary to many of the most thickest conceptions about the Russian Jewish past.
Could I ask you a question? I apologize for being a little late to the lecture, but could you name?
I saw you walk in. It's unforgivable.
My apologies. What's the title of your book?
I'm sorry?
The title of your book.
The title of my book, well, unsurprisingly, Pogrom, and the subtitle, Kishnev and the Tilt of History.
Okay, so my question is, I just finished reading a book called The Adventure of the Peculiar Protocols.
Yes, that's the only book written by a Hollywood screenwriter that I've had an impact on.
Okay, because he's using real names and real events, but
right.
Turns it into like Agatha Christie, a page turner.
Yeah, I can't be responsible for his book, but go on, please.
Okay, but to me it's fascinating that he's describing similar paths that his heroes take.
If you look at the very end of the book, he says that he wrote it after reading my book.
Okay, Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I
Now
solved
you
that mystery for
connected
you.
the dot. You connected the dots. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. He actually, I mean, he wrote a splendid screenplay where I think Sigmund Freud solves Sherlock Holmes' deepest problems, the 2% solution. That's worth seeing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As a couple of questions here are just are about the about life in Russia in general. So, did most Jews in Russia at the start of the 20th century live in mid to large cities, or did they live mostly in shtetls?
Well, I mean, the whole definition of a shtetl is imperfect. I mean, a shtetl, I mean, a shtetl, obviously, a shtot is the Yiddish word for town or a city, and a shtetl is means, it refers to a diminutive, but in the end, a shtetl ends up really meaning a town that I love, or the town that I came to love, or a town that has some lovely qualities. So a lot of the cities, fair-sized cities that Jews lived in, came to be known came to be remembered at least as shtetls. There's a process of urbanization that occurs over the course of the second half of the 19th century, with more and more Jews moving to larger cities because of employment reasons. There's a massive amount of immigration that occurs in Russian Jewry over the course of the second half of the 19th century, and especially the last decades of the 19th century. Out immigration, in other words, immigration from Russia largely to the United States, but also internal immigration, huge amount. And as it happens, most of this internal immigration is from the northern provinces, where barely any pogroms occur, to the southern provinces that are the epicenter of pogroms. The notion that pogroms are the primary reason why Jews emigrate from Russia to the United States is historically incorrect, and certainly up until the pogroms of 1905, 1906. And the Jews are mainly moving for economic reasons. The population of Russian Jewry doubles in size between around 1850 to 1900. The increase proportionally is larger than the population increase of any community in the world outside of China, and for reasons that we're not altogether clear about. And so there's overpopulation, there's underemployment, and underemployment not largely because of governmental anti-Semitism, though governmental anti-Semitism exists, but mostly because Russia, now industrializing, the bulk of its factories are located outside of the areas where Jews live because of where natural resources are located. So there's a lot of push factors pushing Jews to move to places where they could actually earn a decent living. So you have Jews moving from smaller towns to larger places, and moving from the northern provinces to the southern provinces in large numbers. And then Jews especially leaving the areas that are the poorest around Lithuania and that are closest to German trains, and spiriting themselves across the border from Russia, especially to the United States. The Russian government really has no notion of what it wants to do with its Jews. And it wouldn't mind if more Jews leave, but it doesn't make immigration any easier, which is why one hears stories, ancestral stories, of Jews spiriting themselves across the border. By early in the 20th century, it even passes a law that if a Jew converts, he or she can't change their name, their surname. Now, why convert if you can't change your name? And so it's imperial policy is far less homogeneous and coherent than Jews or others in Russia believed at the time. Just one other comment about Russian policy with regard to Jews. It's widely assumed at the time that the pogroms are the fault of the government, not only because of the Plevin letter, but also because of the widespread assumption in Russia that nothing can occur in the Russian regime without the involvement of the government. And this is one of the ways in which the Russian government, the imperial regime, ends up surviving. In retrospect, it looks like something pathetic out of a Chekhov play, but the by 20th century standards, the Romanov regime is the great success story of monarchy. It continues up through the First World War, and perhaps if the First World War not happened, the Russian regime would have continued even longer. But despite the presumption that the regime controls everything on the ground, and hence the assumption that pogroms couldn't break out if the Russian regime wasn't involved, we now know that Russia had fewer police on the ground than proportionally than did France at the same time. So there's the belief that Russia controls everything, the widespread belief held by Jews and non-Jews, which ends up consolidating maintaining Russian power, but is statistically simply incorrect. That was a longer answer to a shorter question.
Thank you. Yeah. And so what was the Russian Orthodox Church involved in instigating or supporting pogroms?
The Russian Orthodox Church, by and large, with rare exceptions, is in this period profoundly antagonistic to Jews. And while pogroms are occurring, you have Orthodox leaders saying things that seem to encourage the Pogromous, and that certainly occurs in Kishnev. But Russian Orthodox teachings in and of themselves don't necessarily ferment pogroms. And the inimical, antagonistic, even profoundly aggressively antagonistic attitudes toward a minority don't necessarily lead to violence in and of themselves. There has to be something that ignites them. And what ignites the violence in Kishnev, I'm convinced, are figures like Khrushchevan, who end up coalescing, as I said before, otherwise inchoate attitudes toward Jews into a particular kind of incendiary ball. And you need figures at the top to coalesce insidious assumptions. I think you living adjacent to Washington, D.C. have greater access to some of that today than I have in California. It's really striking the extent to which respected figures, either ideologues or governmental figures, could actually coalesce sentiments that are by any standards absolutely objectively incorrect and can be actually argued against, and to coalesce them into propagandistic belief. I started this book long before the term fake news became ubiquitous. And I'm glad that I did, because I wouldn't have wanted it shaped inordinately by my preoccupation with contemporary events. But this book really is about fake news and the way in which such news could actually be deeply, emphatically believed, despite all evidence to the contrary.
I have a question. Is there any
Speak a little bit louder.
Is there any relationship between the Kishinev pogrom, and I suppose there were pogroms in Kiev, because there's the statue, I think Robin can help me, Chelmnicki was the founder of pogroms in Kiev. Am I correct? Remember that, Robin, the statue up on the plaza?
Well, there's a terrible pogrom in Kiev in 1905 during the 1905-1906 revolution. The Kish pogrom is a standalone violent event.
Oh.
There is a wave of attacks against Jews in the midst of the constitutional crisis in Russia in 1905-06, where when it's widely believed that Jews and others, but Jews inordinately, are foisting onto the Tsar a parliamentary form of government. In the end, it's a quasi-parliamentary form without much teeth, but it does serve as the Duma created in the wake of that revolution, serves as a bit of a check on the autocracy. So And there is a terrible pogrom in Kishnev. Then, once again, Kishnev comes to be known as the site of many things, not the site quintessentially of a pogrom, while all that Kishnev ends up being remembered as in Jewish history is as the site of a pogrom. And but there are probably about 200 anti-Jewish attacks against Jews between 1905 and 1906. The most vicious pogroms that occur in this region occur after the fall of the Romanov regime, and in the wake of the February and then the Bolshevik Revolution, and especially in the period between 1919, when the Bolsheviks are battling the so-called white troops, the anti-Bolshevik troops. And so the most vicious of pogroms and the most widespread pogroms, in which perhaps as many as 200,000 Jews are killed, we don't even know the numbers, and perhaps as many women raped. And again, it's been almost impossible to document this thoroughly. Occurs once the regime disintegrates, and there's basically massive anarchy and all sorts of armies traversing the area of what was Romanov Russia.
Could I ask, were there any attacks on Jews or criticism, this discrimination against them after the assassination of Alexander II in 1881?
Yeah, of course. There's a wave of pogroms. It seems pretty clear that no Jew was killed in the pogroms of 1881, 1882, but and there are attacks against Jews before. These typically aren't called pogroms. They end up, in retrospect, being called pogroms after the Kishnev pogrom minced the word pogrom. So there are widespread attacks after the assassination of Alexander II. Jews end up being targeted because one of the revolutionaries implicated in the assassination, Hessia Helfman, she's pregnant at the time that she's arrested, and her death sentence is commuted. And the rumor then spreads that Jews were responsible for the killing of the Tsar, and they got away with it. And a wave of attacks against Jews occurs, I guess.
Thank you. I have a great number of questions in the chat. So all the questions from now on will come from the people who have already submitted. There's many more than we'll have a chance to get to this evening. There's a few questions here about the people in Kishnev, as far as whether or not they wrote. I'll sort of summarize a few of them to put them together. Were there any memoirs written by either victims or participants of the Kishnev pogrom, and just what happened to that community after the program? Did some return and leave, or did most stay?
The fullest memoir, it's a memoiristic history written in Russian and published after the Russian Revolution, is actually written by a doctor who is working at the Jewish hospital in Kishinev named Slutsky. The most valuable and fullest reminiscences of the pogrom end up being a part of Bialik's documents. And with the fullest account in Bialik's documents being provided by a Jewish woman named Rivka Schiff, who a recent Jewish immigrant from Romania, who describes in anguished, excruciating detail being raped by as many as 5 or 6 men simultaneously. And hers, I think, by far is the fullest memoiristic account of the pogrom. One feature of these attacks, and an aspect of violence that is also discussed in Jan Gross's brilliant book Neighbors about the Holocaust in Poland, is the intersection between familiarity and ferocity in violence, something that as an historian I can't explain, but that I certainly saw in document after document, somehow familiarity could actually increase ferocity, something that Jan saw in Holocaust Poland, and that is certainly in evidence in Kishnev during the pogrom. At the same time, you have, as I indicated before, large numbers of Jews who run into the homes of non-Jews and are saved, and without any warning whatsoever, clearly, that they're going to be doing this. So it's a town of about 100,000, some 40–50% of the population in 1903 is Jewish. Some 900 Pogromous are arrested, but these include, among the 900, the Jews who were involved in defending their lives. And so we don't know exactly how many Pogromous are arrested. So in this town of some 50 to 60,000 non-Jews, there are some 800 who are involved in the pogrom itself, with large numbers of these Pogromous coming from adjacent villages on the second day of the pogrom with wagons in order to carry away booty. And so once again, you could only, you'd probably begin to stumble historically if you actually accuse the majority of the people in the city of being inimical to Jews. And at the same time, 800 people commanding the streets of a city for a day and a half, engaged in looting and murder, does suggest a great deal of enmity.
Thank you. There's several questions here about the protocols of the Elders of Zion, about some different questions about the authors and its connection to the program itself, and in blood libel. So a couple of names that came up were Alan Dulles, and whether or not Alan Dulles was involved, and the Tsar's Secret Service.
Right. So it was widely assumed until fairly recently that the protocols of the Elders of Zion were the work of the secret police and of an agent named Rachkovsky, and that they were produced in the wake of the First or Second Zionist Congress, and that's largely been disproven. By a number of scholars, and I discuss that at length in my book, and I'd end up entering into linguistic weeds if I were to summarize my arguments now. In the wake of the Pleved letter, it's the government that ends up being held responsible. Now, the Russian government, it was rare in late imperial Russia to find an official in the government who didn't dislike Jews, and disliking Jews was a was an almost uniform assumption. But disliking Jews and actually fomenting pogroms were not the same thing, and so in the wake of the Pleved letter, figures like Khrushchev end up being rather marginalized as having had influence on the riot. And largely because with the Pleved letter, you actually have the culprit being the Russian regime itself. What greater culprit could there possibly be? The story, in other words, ends up being rather less dramatic in many ways, than rather more complicated than comes to be believed by Jews and others. And that's the story that I and others have sought to tell. I talk about the work of, there's been superb work by a German historian named Michael Hagemeister and others. I summarize his work in that Atlantic article that I think was sent out to you along with the announcement of my of this lecture. And if you have any questions about this, just feel free to email me after the talk in the next few days, and I'd be willing to discuss with you what it is that historians have concluded over the last 5, 10, 15 years. This original version of the protocols ends up being the most obscure version. It's published in a newspaper owned by Khrushchev, but you could only buy through subscription. The first histories of the protocols didn't even know that it existed, and were written actually without any knowledge that the original document had been published in this newspaper. The first version is filled with what I've called linguistic fingerprints, because there are word usages that are only distinctive to this particular region and that aren't used elsewhere in Russia. And once book versions of the protocols ends up being published in 1905 and later, these are all Russified, and all of these words are expunged from the text. And so there really is sufficient evidence that this was produced by Khrushchev and his entourage, and in the wake of the Kishnev pogrom.
Thank you. So there's a question, what do we know actually triggered the pogrom, and what was the result of the trials of the pogromists you mentioned?
Yeah, so what triggers the pogrom is the presence of these far-right anti-Semitic figures. Khrushchev has a newspaper, Bessarabets, in Kishinev, which is the only real newspaper in the region, and has been producing over the course of the last couple of 2 years before the pogrom breaks out, all kinds of insidious attacks on Jews. There is a ritual murder case. A teenager ends up disappearing in a nearby town. He's not a child, but he's a teenager. Usually ritual murder is connected with a child. It's discovered that that a relative of his killed him in order to inherit some money. The coroner, there are 2 coroners' reports that this is the problem with disproving ritual murder. How do you disprove something that doesn't exist? So the way ritual murder ends up being disproven, and disproven in this particular case, in an event that ends up inspiring the Kishnev pogrom in no small measure, is that what the coroner demonstrates is that no blood was drained from the murdered teenager, with the presumption that the ritual murder involves the draining of blood before the Passover holiday and the use of such blood in the baking of matzah. But if blood had been drained, would that have proven that there was a ritual murder? Because ritual murder doesn't exist. And so you end up with this bizarre conundrum with regard to this canard. But despite the coroner's report, Khrushchev newspaper insists that Jews have killed a child. It also insists that the Jews had figured out a way of cornering the wine market, which is very important in this region, by producing wine without the use of grapes. And I gave a book talk somewhere, and a chemist actually told me, a chemist in the audience told me that actually this is possible, but I can't verify that empirically. And so the newspaper edited by Khrushchev is attacking Jews. There's a ritual murder charge that persuades a sufficient number of people the Jews are engaged in insidious behavior. There's a downturn in the agricultural market in 1903, and there's this clutch of anti-Semites responsible for the writing of the protocols, who end up energizing a group of right-wing seminarians. It's a large seminary in Kishnev, and who end up energizing Easter celebrants and others to attack Jews on the first day of the pogrom. This seems to be at least some of the significant ingredients that lights the match.
And the second part of the question was, what was the outcome of the trials?
Right. Yeah, there are 2 of the pogromists who were put to death. Most received very, very light sentences, but the trials are serious trials. There is a Russian judiciary that takes these crimes seriously, but the defense is able to mount a powerful defense, arguing that Jews exaggerate, and there are Jewish witnesses who end up, as the English say, over-egging the pudding, and making a case for certain acts of violence that are then disproven, that then discredits Jewish legitimate accusations. So the trials are serious. The punishments, by and large, fairly light, and certainly nothing to dissuade future violence. What the Kishinev pogrom does do is and the widespread belief in its wake that Jewish males were cowardly, is that it inspires very different behavior soon afterwards when there's an anti-Jewish riot in Gomel. And in the Gomel riot, there are more Pogromous killed than Jews. And with all kinds of trials afterwards, trials mostly of Jews who are defending their lives.
And briefly, is there a reason why less attention was paid to some of these subsequent, the later violent pogroms that you mentioned?
Yeah, well, it all has to do with how history is shaped, and the Kishnev ends up entering into the inner workings of almost every influential sector of Jewish life, Zionists and socialists, ends up becoming the clarion call of Israel Zangwill's play, The Melting Pot, where the protagonist, a violinist, has been seared by the Kishinev pogrom, and ends up falling in love. Actually, I haven't reread the play for a while, but the Kishinev pogrom is at the epicenter. It's at the epicenter of so-called assimilationist literature, Jewish assimilationist literature, because the Zangwill play is a kind of paean to assimilation, while Zangwill is the head of a sector of Jewish nationalism. It's a somewhat bifurcated souls angle. It ends up entering into the inner workings of Zionism, the inner workings of Jewish socialism. It ends up being institutionalized, and consequently, its lessons end up being remembered. There's a amazing article that I found in a Yiddish periodical in 1923, Bicherwelt, a book review volume that is reviewing the first volume of a history of the pogroms of 1918, 1920, 21, vicious events that I spoke about earlier. And at the beginning of this review, it says this volume is all the more useful because these events are beginning to already be forgotten. Massively violent events that traverse the entire region of East European Jewry, from Poland deep into interior Russia, and already beginning to be forgotten already in 1923, with the lessons of the Kishinev pogrom never forgotten. Almost invariably, whenever Benjamin Netanyahu quotes a poem in order to make a case for vengeance, he quotes Bialik. Bialik is what he learned in school. Bialik is what exists. Bialik is what has entered into the sinews of Jewish memory. So it's just another example of the shaping of history and the way in which some events end up etching themselves and so much else just becomes forgotten.
Thank you. So as a concluding question, are there any final lessons that you think are most relevant for today?
You know, in thinking about the book as I was finishing it, it occurred to me that to some extent, though I wasn't writing it with any larger cultural and political lessons in mind, among the more salient lessons that I was thinking about had to do to some extent with the exorcism of some of our assumptions our regnant assumptions about the Jewish past, the inevitability of Gentile hostility, um, the so many of the lessons that end up being learned from the Kishinev pogrom end up, I think, haunting Jews. And so to some extent, I think the event that I worked so assiduously to try to document is an event whose regnant lessons, I think, deserve on some level to be exercised and to be reevaluated. And certainly in the wake of finishing this book and then living through what our country has lived through over the last many years and continues to live through, what astonishes me perhaps most of all is the immense chasm between what actually is documented, what is knowable about this event, and what ends up being remembered about this event. And the lessons that we can take away from things that we live with could be so vastly different from what actually occurred. And the way in which these can chisel themselves so deeply into one's consciousness. So I suppose one of the more haunting lessons that I've come away with is about the astonishing resilience of fake news. I've always avoided in the classroom and elsewhere as someone teaching Jewish history, entering into politics. It's an especially perilous thing, especially for someone like myself who teaches, among other things, Zionism, which is so hotly contested in the university world and elsewhere. I don't feel any longer that talking about the pervasiveness of the use of fake news is something that's political. It's something, it seems to me, that cuts across or should cut across political lines. Has nothing to do with the fundamental differences in the United States between Democrats and Republicans about fiscal policy, about taxation, about the role of the federal government. It has to do with analytical truth. And if in university life, we're not committed to analytical truth, to actually serious investigation, then we're committed to nothing. And at the same time, we have to investigate our own presuppositions. In many ways, as someone who sympathizes more with aspects of the left than with the right, certainly, I have to recognize that some of the more regnant, powerful assumptions that the Jewish left believed about conservatism are the product of myths that are not historically valid. And those lessons I have to learn also. You're constantly questioning your assumptions as an historian. It could lead to absolute paralysis. And what you do as an historian is you're always at work between the intersection between continuing to question your assumptions and writer's block. And you don't want to suffer from the latter, and you have to continue to question yourself as much as possible. So this has been a pleasure. Good meeting all of you. And I'm sorry we couldn't be in the same room together. I deeply regret that. Matthew, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For this engaging lecture. I'm sure our participants have a great deal to reflect upon. Just before you leave, I wanted to introduce Rabbi Gordy Fuller, who was our previous executive director.
Gordy, let me
early on. He's
let me
here
see
on this
you.
call.
Ah, there you are.
So you can.
All right. So what does retirement feel like?
Not what I expected, because things changed from when I began planning it. But day to day, it's going fine, and we're all staying healthy, and I hope everybody there is too. This was wonderful. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Thank you so much. And I'll be in touch with a challenging question, or whatever you call difficult questions.
Yeah, and I meant what I said. Just feel free to email me, and I answer my emails, and I know some of what I said might have surprised some of you. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank
Bye-bye.
you. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. we look forward to seeing you again this Monday at 11 a.m. with Aviva Zornberg. So check out our website for more information and have a good night.